Across the world's frozen edges, from the Arctic wilds of Alaska to the unforgiving tundra of Siberia, some hunters and villagers face more than just the cold. When nature's apex predator grows desperate, no wall, weapon, or distance feels safe. These aren't just stories of survival. They're chilling accounts of what happens when polar bears break through the human line. In this video, we uncover the terrifying moments when man met beast, and not everyone came back. From sudden ambushes to eerie disappearances, this is survival, panic, and resilience, one story at a time. Point Lay, Alaska, had always been a settlement that existed on the edge of the world. Tucked against the icy Arctic coast, this remote Inupiat village housed fewer than 300 souls who had learned to live in harmony with the unforgiving landscape. By 2025, the effects of climate change had become undeniable, with declining sea ice patterns forcing polar bears to venture farther inland than their ancestors ever had. The residents knew the risks, but nothing could have prepared them for what would unfold on June 27, 2025. The midnight sun cast an eerie glow across the settlement as most residents remained indoors due to a temporary power outage that had swept through the village earlier that evening. The generator that typically powered the community had failed, leaving the settlement in an unusual darkness, broken only by the pale Arctic light that never fully disappeared during the summer months. The silence was broken only by the occasional creak of wooden structures settling in the cold and the distant sound of waves against the shore. Carl Donnett, a schoolteacher who had moved to Point Lay 3 years earlier from Anchorage, stepped outside his small cabin to investigate the fuel generator. He had always been handy with mechanical equipment, and the villagers often turned to him when their aging infrastructure needed attention. Carl approached the generator shed, flashlight in hand, completely unaware that he was being watched from the shadows beyond the village perimeter. The polar bear that emerged from the darkness was a massive male, estimated later to weigh over 1,200 pounds. Starvation had driven the creature to desperation, and the scent of human habitation had drawn it like a beacon across the tundra. Marine biologists would later determine that the bear had swum over 60 miles through increasingly fragmented ice, burning through its fat reserves in a futile search for seals that were no longer accessible due to the changing ice patterns. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. The bear struck Carl before the teacher could even register the threat, the impact sending him sprawling across the gravel. The attack was swift and brutal, driven by a combination of hunger and the stress of prolonged starvation. The bear's massive paws and powerful jaws made quick work of its first victim, but the scent of more humans nearby only intensified its frenzied state. The creature moved through the settlement with a purpose that seemed almost methodical. The bear attacked 2 more houses before the residents could mount any organized defense. The residents, caught off guard by the power outage and the unprecedented nature of the attack, struggled to respond effectively. Emergency calls flooded out to the nearest response teams, but the closest armed personnel were stationed 80 miles away in Utqiagvik. Ella Kaswak, a 24-year-old volunteer EMT who had grown up in Point Lay, managed to gather a group of children from the surrounding houses and barricade them in the basement of the town hall. The reinforced concrete structure had been built to withstand Arctic storms, but even its heavy doors groaned under the bear's assault as it detected the human scent within. Ella knew that their makeshift shelter would not hold for long. The young woman retrieved a 20-gauge shotgun from the emergency supplies that were kept in the town hall. Her hands trembled as she loaded the shells, but her training kicked in as she fired 2 warning shots toward the ceiling. The thunderous noise in the confined space was deafening, but it had the desired effect of startling the bear long enough for it to pause its attack on the door. The gunshots also attracted the attention of Neil Hargrave and Victor Larson, two fishermen who had been working late on their equipment near the harbor. The men had heard the commotion and were already moving toward the village when they heard Ella's shots. Neil grabbed his scope .306 rifle from their skiff, while Victor helped him climb onto the roof of a nearby tool shed to get a clear line of sight. The bear had returned to its assault on the town hall when Neil took his first shot. The bullet struck the creature in the upper rib cage, spinning it around but failing to bring it down. The wounded animal's rage only intensified as it turned toward this new threat. Victor spotted for his partner as Neil worked the bolt action, chambering another round. The second shot found its mark, as did the third and fourth, before the massive predator finally collapsed in the gravel outside the town hall. The aftermath was devastating. 4 residents had lost their lives during the rampage, while 3 others suffered critical injuries that required immediate evacuation to Anchorage. The bear was later examined by wildlife officials who confirmed that extreme emaciation had driven it to this desperate act. The creature's stomach contained only small amounts of vegetation and debris, evidence of its prolonged starvation. The village held a memorial service for the victims 2 weeks later, and by September, electric fencing had been installed around the entire perimeter of Point Lay. The tragedy sparked changes in Arctic community preparedness protocols, with emergency response teams now stationed closer to vulnerable settlements during the summer months when polar bear encounters were most likely. For Ella Kaswak, the trauma of that night lingered long after the physical wounds had healed. She eventually channeled her experience into becoming a certified wildlife emergency responder, traveling to remote communities across Alaska to help them prepare for similar encounters. She often reflected on how quickly their peaceful village had been transformed into a scene of horror, and how the changing climate continued to push desperate animals into conflict with human settlements along the Arctic coast. The wilderness outside Gillum, Manitoba, had always been known for its unpredictable nature and harsh conditions. Located in the heart of the Canadian boreal forest, this remote area served as a transition zone between the dense woodlands to the south and the Arctic tundra stretching northward. By May 1998, the spring thaw was well underway, creating a muddy and treacherous landscape that challenged even the most experienced outdoorsmen. Barry Compton had been hunting these forests for over 20 years, and his knowledge of the terrain was legendary among the local hunting community. His childhood friend Luke Weber had joined him on countless expeditions, and their partnership had become the stuff of local folklore. The two men had decided to venture approximately 6 miles north of the Fox Lake area for an early scouting expedition, hoping to identify prime locations for the upcoming moose season. Their campsite was strategically chosen in a small clearing surrounded by mature spruce trees, providing both shelter from the wind and easy access to game trails. The location was well within known polar bear territory, but neither man expected to encounter the massive predators so far inland during the spring months. Polar bears typically remain near the Hudson Bay coastline, following the ice edge as it retreated northward with the warming temperatures. The evening of May 15th passed without incident as the two hunters settled into their routine. They had properly secured their food supplies in bear-proof containers and hung their packs well above ground level, following protocols they had learned through decades of wilderness experience. Luke Weber had made one critical error, however, keeping a small pouch of dried salmon jerky beside his sleeping bag for a late-night snack. Around 3:15 in the morning, Barry Compton was awakened by an unusual sound that cut through the normal forest ambiance. A low, rumbling grunt emanated from somewhere just outside their tent, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing and snuffling. The experienced hunter immediately recognized that something large was investigating their campsite, but before he could reach for his rifle, their peaceful night exploded into chaos. The polar bear had approached their tent with the stealth that only an apex predator could manage. Despite weighing over 800 pounds, the animal had moved through the forest with remarkable silence, drawn by the scent of the salmon jerky that Luke had carelessly stored beside his sleeping area. When the bear finally made its move, the attack was swift and devastating. The massive creature crashed through the side of their tent with enough force to send Luke Weber flying straight through the opposite wall. The impact launched him several feet through the air before he landed hard in the underbrush beyond their campsite. Barry watched in horror as his friend disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind only a gaping hole in their shelter and the enormous white form of an enraged polar bear. Barry scrambled toward the tree line where they had stacked their hunting equipment, his bare feet slipping on the damp forest floor. His hands shook as he grabbed his scoped .270 Winchester, working the bolt action to chamber around while trying to locate his friend in the darkness. The bear had momentarily lost interest in the tent and was now investigating the area where Luke had landed. The hunter fired 2 warning shots into the air, the sharp cracks echoing through the forest and startling the massive predator. The bear reared up on its hind legs, standing nearly 9 feet tall as it tried to identify this new threat. Luke Weber used this distraction to crawl beneath their all-terrain vehicle, where he remained hidden while Barry maintained his position near the weapons cache. For the next 20 minutes, the polar bear circled their destroyed campsite with methodical precision. The animal seemed reluctant to leave, occasionally stopping to investigate the scattered remains of their equipment. Barry continued to make noise, banging pots together and maintaining a steady stream of shouting, hoping to convince the bear that the area was too dangerous to remain in. The standoff finally ended when the bear apparently decided that the humans posed too great a threat to justify whatever food reward might be available. The massive creature melted back into the forest as silently as it had appeared, leaving behind only enormous paw prints and the destruction of their campsite. Neither man was seriously injured, though Luke suffered minor cuts and bruises from his unexpected flight through the tent wall. They abandoned their equipment and began the grueling 6-mile hike back to the highway, trudging through bog and dense brush in the pre-dawn darkness. The journey took nearly 4 hours, and both men were exhausted by the time they reached civilization. The experience fundamentally changed their approach to wilderness camping. Barry Compton continued hunting in the region for many years afterward, but he never again allowed any food items to remain unsecured in their sleeping area. Every May, he recounted the story to his nephews as a cautionary tale about the importance of proper food storage and the unpredictable nature of wildlife encounters in the northern forest. Utqiagvik, Alaska, formerly known as Barrow, represented the northernmost settlement in the United States, perched precariously on the edge of the Arctic Ocean. The town had served as a gateway to the frozen wilderness for generations, attracting researchers, photographers, and adventure seekers who sought to experience the raw beauty of the Arctic landscape. By February 2012, the community had become increasingly dependent on tourism revenue, with skilled guides leading visitors across the treacherous ice flats that stretched endlessly toward the North Pole. Todd Alrich had established himself as one of the most reliable snowmobile guides in the region, with over 15 years of experience navigating the shifting ice formations and unpredictable weather patterns. His reputation for safety and his intimate knowledge of the terrain made him the preferred choice for professional photographers and documentary crews who needed to access remote locations for their work. On February 18, 2012, Todd was leading a three-person photography expedition across the ice flats, approximately 8 miles north of Utqiagvik. His clients were Marissa Hale, a wildlife photographer from Colorado, Andre Wick, a documentary filmmaker from Germany, and George Nguyen, a photojournalist specializing in climate change stories. The group had ventured onto the frozen sea ice to capture images during the blue hour when the Arctic light created dramatic shadows and ethereal colors across the landscape. The ice conditions appeared stable, with thick formations that had been frozen solid for several months. Todd had checked the weather reports and ice bulletins before departure, ensuring that their planned route would keep them well away from areas where recent pressure ridges or open water might pose a danger. The temperature was holding steady at minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to maintain the integrity of the ice surface. The photographers had been working for approximately 2 hours when Marissa Hale noticed something unusual behind a nearby pressure ridge. She initially dismissed it as a snow formation or piece of debris, but continued observation revealed that the white shape was moving with deliberate purpose. Her years of wildlife photography experience had taught her to recognize predator behavior, and something about the creature's movements triggered her alarm instincts. The polar bear had been using the pressure ridge as cover, employing hunting techniques that had been refined through thousands of years of evolution. The massive male, estimated to weigh over 1,000 pounds, had detected the human scent from a considerable distance and had been stalking the group for nearly an hour. The bear's patient approach demonstrated the intelligence and tactical thinking that made these predators so formidable in their natural environment. When the attack came, it happened with explosive speed that caught everyone off guard. The bear emerged from its hiding place behind the snowdrift and covered the distance to Todd's snowmobile in a matter of seconds. The impact knocked the guide completely off his machine, sending him tumbling across the ice surface while the bear maintained its momentum. The force of the collision broke several of Todd's ribs and left him dazed and unable to mount any effective resistance. The bear seized him by the leg with its powerful jaws and began dragging him across the ice, moving with surprising speed despite the burden of carrying a full-grown man. The other members of the group watched in horror as their guide disappeared into the maze of ice formations, leaving behind only a trail of disturbed snow and drops of blood. Andre Wick and George Nguyen immediately began searching through Todd's emergency equipment bag, which had been secured to his snowmobile. Among the survival gear, they located a flare gun with several signal flares, designed for use in exactly this type of emergency situation. The two men worked frantically to load and fire the device, their hands shaking from both cold and adrenaline. The first flare arced high into the Arctic sky, creating a brilliant red streak against the pale blue light of the polar twilight. The second flare was fired more strategically, aimed to pass directly over the bear's position approximately half a mile from where the attack had occurred. The sudden burst of light and sound finally startled the massive predator enough to make it release its grip on Todd and retreat toward the frozen surf. The rescue operation required the combined efforts of local search teams and medical personnel who reached the scene within 45 minutes of the initial distress call. Todd was evacuated to Anchorage for emergency surgery, where doctors worked to repair the extensive damage to his leg and foot. Despite their efforts, complications from frostbite and tissue damage ultimately required the amputation of several toes and part of his foot. The incident prompted significant changes in Alaska's commercial guiding regulations, with new requirements for mandatory wildlife deterrent equipment on all tourist excursions. Tour operators were now required to carry bear spray noisemakers and emergency signaling devices, while guides underwent enhanced training in wildlife encounter protocols. Todd Ulrich never returned to commercial guiding after his recovery, though he remained in Utqiagvik and eventually took a position with the local emergency response team. He often reflected on how quickly a routine photography expedition had transformed into a life-threatening encounter, and he used his experience to help train other guides in proper safety procedures for Arctic wildlife encounters. Kodiak Island's wilderness interior had remained largely unchanged for centuries, a vast expanse of rugged mountains, dense forests, and hidden valleys that challenged even the most experienced outdoorsmen. Located in the Gulf of Alaska, the island's remote regions were accessible only by float plane or grueling overland treks that could take days to complete. By November 1981, the harsh winter conditions had already begun to set in, creating treacherous travel conditions that deterred all but the most dedicated hunters and trappers. Kurt Roenick and Dennis Malloy had been hunting partners for over a decade, their friendship forged through countless expeditions into Alaska's most challenging terrain. Both men possessed the skills and experience necessary to survive in the wilderness for extended periods, and their reputation for success had earned them respect among the local hunting community. They had planned this particular expedition for months, targeting a remote trapping cabin that was rumored to be located deep in the island's interior. The cabin they sought had been built in the 1960s by a trapper named Jonas Whitmore, who had used it as a seasonal base for his operations. The structure was known to be well built and stocked with basic supplies, making it an attractive destination for hunters who needed shelter during extended expeditions. According to their information, the cabin was located approximately 12 miles from the nearest access point, requiring a challenging snowshoe journey through difficult terrain. On November 14, 1981, the two hunters began their trek into the wilderness, carrying heavy packs loaded with hunting equipment, food supplies, and emergency gear. The weather conditions were marginal, with intermittent snow squalls and temperatures hovering near 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The landscape was already covered with several inches of snow, making navigation difficult and adding to the physical demands of their journey. After 8 hours of grueling travel through dense forest and steep ravines, Kurt and Dennis finally reached the coordinates where the cabin was supposed to be located. What they discovered left both men speechless and filled with a sense of dread that would haunt them for years to come. The cabin was still there, but it had been completely destroyed by some massive force that had torn the structure apart with incredible violence. The front door had been ripped from its hinges and lay twisted in the snow several yards away from the cabin. The wooden walls bore deep gouges and claw marks that suggested an animal of enormous size and strength had systematically attacked the structure. The logs that formed the cabin's foundation had been scattered across the clearing, some weighing several hundred pounds each, indicating that whatever had destroyed the building possessed incredible physical power. Inside the ruined cabin, the scene was even more disturbing. The wooden floor was stained with dark patches that could only be blood, frozen solid in the sub-zero temperatures. Furniture had been smashed to splinters, and supplies were scattered throughout the debris. Most unsettling of all, there were no human remains to be found, nor any clear tracks leading away from the destruction. The cabin's logbook, which had miraculously survived the destruction, provided the only clue to what might have happened. The final entry was dated 3 days earlier and had been written by someone who signed himself simply as J.R. Kurt, and Dennis recognized the handwriting as belonging to Jimmy Randolph, a solitary hunter they had encountered briefly 2 winters earlier at a supply station near the coast. The entry described Jimmy's activities during his stay at the cabin, including his observations of local wildlife and weather conditions. The final sentence, written in increasingly shaky handwriting, noted that he had observed unusual movement near the frozen lake adjacent to the cabin. His last words suggested that he believed he might be seeing Kodiak brown bears that had not yet entered hibernation, though such late-season activity seemed unusual for the massive predators. The mystery deepened when Kurt and Dennis examined the area around the cabin more carefully. Despite the obvious violence of the attack, there were no clear animal tracks in the snow, which had fallen after the destruction occurred. The absence of drag marks or blood trails leading away from the cabin suggested that whatever fate had befallen Jimmy, Randolph had been resolved entirely within the confines of the destroyed structure. Both hunters agreed that they needed to leave the area immediately and report their findings to the authorities. The sense of menace that permeated the scene was palpable, and neither man felt comfortable remaining in the vicinity as darkness approached. They began their return journey immediately, pushing themselves to cover as much ground as possible before nightfall. The trek back to civilization took nearly 12 hours, with both men driven by an urgent need to escape the wilderness. They reported their discovery to the Alaska State Troopers, who launched an investigation that ultimately proved inconclusive. Search teams found no additional evidence, and Jimmy Randolph was officially listed as missing, though his fate remained unknown. The incident became part of local folklore, with various theories proposed to explain what had happened at the remote cabin. Some suggested that a massive Kodiak brown bear might have been responsible, while others speculated about more exotic possibilities. The isolated nature of the location and the lack of witnesses meant that the truth would likely never be known. Kurt Roenick was profoundly affected by the experience and never returned to Kodiak Island for hunting expeditions. He often spoke about the sense of evil that had seemed to permeate the destroyed cabin, and he warned other hunters about the dangers of venturing too far into the island's remote interior. The memory of that November day remained vivid in his mind for the rest of his life, serving as a reminder of the mysterious and sometimes malevolent forces that could be encountered in Alaska's vast wilderness. The waters off the coast of Nunavut had become increasingly unpredictable by August 2007, as climate change continued to alter the traditional patterns of sea ice formation and breakup. This vast region of the Canadian Arctic had served as a vital hunting and fishing ground for generations of Inuit families, who had developed sophisticated knowledge of the area's seasonal rhythms and wildlife behavior. The changing conditions posed new challenges for commercial fishing operations, which had to adapt their methods to account for shifting ice patterns and altered animal migration routes. Elias Boudreau had been working these waters for over 25 years, first as a crew member on larger vessels and eventually as the owner-operator of his own commercial crabbing operation. His intimate knowledge of the local waters and his ability to read ice conditions had made him one of the most successful independent fishermen in the region. His nephew Jérôme Lafleur had joined the operation 5 years earlier, bringing youthful energy and modern equipment knowledge to complement his uncle's experience. On August 12, 2007, the two men were operating approximately 14 miles offshore in their 26-foot aluminum skiff, working a series of crab traps that had been set several days earlier. The ice breakup had occurred later than usual that year, creating favorable conditions for crabbing as the cold water temperatures had concentrated the shellfish in accessible areas. Visibility was excellent, with clear skies and calm seas providing ideal working conditions. The morning had been productive, with several traps yielding good catches of snow crab and king crab. Elias and Jerome had established a steady rhythm, hauling traps, sorting the catch, and resetting the equipment with practiced efficiency. The work was physically demanding, but both men were accustomed to the rigors of commercial fishing in Arctic waters. Around noon, Jerome noticed what appeared to be a floating object in the water behind their boat. His initial assumption was that they were seeing a piece of debris or perhaps a buoy that had broken free from someone else's equipment. However, continued observation revealed that the object was moving with purpose, maintaining a steady course that seemed to be directed toward their vessel. As the object drew closer, its true nature became apparent. A massive polar bear was swimming directly toward them, its powerful strokes propelling it through the water with remarkable speed and endurance. The bear's head remained above the surface, its black nose and dark eyes clearly visible as it focused on their boat with single-minded determination. Jerome immediately alerted his uncle to the situation, and both men began to assess their options. The bear was still several hundred yards away, but its swimming speed was impressive and it showed no signs of tiring or changing course. Elias increased the boat's speed, hoping to simply outrun the pursuing animal, but the bear matched their pace with apparent ease. For the next 45 minutes, the polar bear maintained its relentless pursuit of their vessel. The animal's swimming endurance was extraordinary, covering several miles through open water without showing any signs of fatigue. Elias pushed their outboard motor to its limits, but the bear continued to gain ground whenever they slowed down to navigate around ice floes or equipment. The chase became increasingly tense as the bear closed the distance between them. At one point, the animal came within 10 feet of their boat, close enough for the men to see the powerful muscles working beneath its thick fur and the determined expression in its dark eyes. The bear's massive size was apparent even when partially submerged, and both men realized that their small vessel would offer little protection if the animal decided to attack. Jerome retrieved his pump-action Mossberg shotgun from the equipment storage and loaded it with slug rounds. When the bear approached within 10 feet of their stern, he fired 2 warning shots into the water near the animal's head. The thunderous reports echoed across the water, and the sudden splashes from the slugs finally seemed to give the bear pause in its pursuit. The polar bear stopped swimming and treaded water for several minutes, as if considering whether to continue its chase. The animal's massive head remained above the surface, and its intelligent eyes continued to track their movements. Finally, perhaps realizing that the humans posed a genuine threat, the bear began to swim away toward a distant ice floe. Elias and Jerome watched in fascination as the bear reached the ice floe and hauled itself out of the water with surprising grace for such a large animal. The creature stood on the ice for several minutes, shaking the water from its fur and continuing to observe their boat before finally disappearing behind the ice formation. The experience left both men profoundly shaken. Jerome had never imagined that a polar bear could swim with such speed and endurance, and the animal's apparent determination to reach their boat was unlike anything either man had encountered in their years of Arctic fishing. The incident highlighted the remarkable adaptability of polar bears and their willingness to pursue potential food sources across vast distances. The encounter had lasting effects on both men's careers. Jerome found himself constantly looking over his shoulder during subsequent fishing trips, never quite able to forget the sight of the massive predator swimming relentlessly toward their boat. The stress of the experience, combined with concerns about increasingly unpredictable wildlife encounters, led him to sell his shares in the family fishing operation 2 months later. Elias continued to work the waters off Nunavut for several more years, but he never forgot the 45-minute chase that had demonstrated the remarkable capabilities of Arctic wildlife. He had a photograph of the bear's head taken during the encounter, enlarged and framed, hanging it in his home as a reminder of the power and determination of the animals that shared the Arctic waters. The experience, he often said, had taught him humility and respect for the natural world that sustained his livelihood. The Siberian tundra north of Norilsk represented one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, where temperatures could plummet to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit and blizzards could appear without warning. This vast expanse of frozen wilderness had remained largely unchanged for millennia, supporting only the hardiest wildlife and the most experienced human inhabitants. By March 1992, the harsh winter conditions had reached their peak, creating a landscape that challenged even the most skilled Arctic hunters. Valery Kristenko had spent his entire adult life hunting in the region surrounding Norilsk, the northernmost major city in the world. His knowledge of the tundra's seasonal patterns and wildlife behavior had been accumulated through decades of experience, making him one of the most respected hunters in the local community. The collapse of the Soviet Union had created economic hardships that made hunting an essential survival skill, and Valery's expertise was highly valued by his neighbors. On March 22, 1992, Valery discovered fresh polar bear tracks in the snow approximately 8 miles north of the city. The tracks were unusually large and appeared to have been made within the past day, suggesting that a significant predator was operating in the area. Polar bears were rare visitors to the inland tundra, typically remaining near the Arctic coast, where they could hunt seals on the sea ice. The hunter's curiosity was piqued by the unusual nature of the tracks, which seemed to indicate that the bear might be moving toward a den site or perhaps following a food source. Valery reasoned that tracking the animal could lead him to a valuable prize, as polar bear pelts were highly sought after and could provide significant income during the difficult economic times that had befallen the region. Valery prepared for the expedition with his usual thoroughness, packing his trusted Mosin Nagant rifle, ammunition, and survival gear. He dressed in layers of heavy wool clothing topped by a fox fur hat that had been made by his grandmother decades earlier. The temperature was holding steady at minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to be dangerous but not extreme by local standards. The trail led steadily northward across the open tundra, meandering between low ridges and following the natural contours of the landscape. The tracks were easy to follow in the fresh snow, and Valery made good time during the first few hours of his pursuit. The bear's gait suggested that it was moving with purpose rather than wandering aimlessly, which reinforced his belief that it was heading toward a specific destination. By early afternoon, the weather began to deteriorate rapidly. Dark clouds gathered on the northern horizon, and the wind picked up significantly, creating the conditions that typically preceded a major blizzard. Valery recognized the warning signs and realized that he should consider turning back, but the bear tracks remained clear and seemed to be leading toward a rocky outcropping that might provide shelter. The blizzard struck with the sudden fury that characterized Siberian weather systems. Within minutes, visibility dropped to near zero, and the wind-driven snow created a whiteout that made navigation impossible. Valery lost sight of the bear tracks almost immediately, and his own footprints began to fill with snow, eliminating any possibility of retracing his route. Disoriented and struggling against the wind, Valery wandered for hours before stumbling into a shallow ravine that offered some protection from the storm. The fall was unexpected and violent, sending him tumbling down the rocky slope before he could arrest his descent. He landed hard at the bottom, breaking 2 fingers on his left hand and suffering bruises and cuts from the sharp rocks. The ravine provided shelter from the worst of the wind, but it also became a trap as the snow accumulated around him. Valerie managed to find a dead spruce tree and used his knife to strip bark and gather moss, creating a makeshift shelter that would protect him from the elements. He spent the first night huddled against the tree, conserving his body heat and waiting for the storm to pass. When dawn broke, the blizzard had moved on, but Valerie found himself in an unfamiliar landscape that bore no resemblance to the terrain he had crossed the previous day. The storm had deposited several feet of new snow, obscuring landmarks and making it impossible to determine his location. His compass still functioned, but without recognizable reference points, navigation remained problematic. For 3 days, Valerie wandered across the tundra, following ice patterns and wind directions in an attempt to find his way back to civilization. His food supplies were quickly exhausted, and he was forced to eat snow and strip bark from the occasional stunted trees he encountered. The broken fingers on his left hand made it difficult to handle his rifle effectively, and the constant cold began to take its toll on his physical condition. On the second night, while sheltering in another ravine, Valerie's exhausted mind began playing tricks on him. Through the swirling snow and fog, he thought he glimpsed what appeared to be a large figure moving across a distant ridge. The shape was indistinct in the poor visibility, and he quickly realized that his fatigue and hypothermia were causing him to misinterpret natural formations and shadows. The brief hallucination troubled him, serving as a stark reminder of how the extreme conditions were affecting his mental state. Valerie understood that exhaustion and cold could cause the mind to create false perceptions, and he focused on staying alert and maintaining his grip on reality during the remaining hours of darkness. On the third day, search teams from Norilsk finally located Valerie near a half-frozen stream approximately 15 miles from where he had started his tracking expedition. He was severely dehydrated and suffering from partial frostbite on his extremities, but he had survived the ordeal through his wilderness skills and determination. The rescue team transported him back to the city, where he received medical treatment for his injuries. The rescue operation required significant resources, with search teams using snowmobiles and tracking dogs to locate Valerie in the vast wilderness. The searchers had been hampered by the same weather conditions that had trapped him, and the operation had been complicated by the remote location and challenging terrain. The fact that he had survived 3 days in such harsh conditions without adequate shelter or food supplies was considered remarkable by the rescue personnel. During his recovery at the Norilsk Medical Facility, Valerie underwent treatment for severe dehydration and frostbite damage to his fingers and toes. The medical staff noted that his survival had been aided by his extensive wilderness experience and his ability to improvise shelter using natural materials. His broken fingers healed slowly, and he retained permanent stiffness in 2 joints that reminded him daily of his ordeal. The incident sparked discussions within the local hunting community about the dangers of pursuing predators alone in remote areas. Several experienced hunters noted that polar bears were becoming more common in the inland regions, possibly driven by changes in sea ice conditions that were affecting their traditional hunting grounds. This observation proved prescient, as similar encounters would become more frequent in subsequent years. Valerie's experience with hypothermia-induced hallucinations became a cautionary tale within the local hunting community, illustrating how extreme conditions could affect even experienced outdoorsmen. Medical professionals explain that such perceptual disturbances were common during severe exposure incidents, as the brain struggled to process sensory information under extreme stress. The experience profoundly changed Valeri's approach to hunting and his relationship with the wilderness. He continued to hunt in the region for several more years, but he never again ventured alone into the remote tundra areas north of the city. He later admitted that the most frightening aspect of the ordeal had been the realization of how quickly the harsh conditions could impair his judgment and perception, emphasizing the importance of never underestimating the psychological effects of extreme cold and exhaustion. Years later, Valerie would reflect on how the pursuit of polar bear tracks had transformed from a routine hunting expedition into a survival ordeal that challenged everything he thought he knew about the Arctic environment. The experience served as a reminder of the wilderness's capacity to humble even the most experienced outdoorsman, and the importance of respecting the natural forces that governed life in the far north.